How's it going? So today we're going to look at episode 3 of season 2 of House of the Dragon. This episode starts with the Bracken and Blackwood boys that we seen in the trailer video, and in the trailer it was notable, and I even noted in the last video, that it looked like these Blackwood boys were mocking this Bracken boy and trying to provoke a reaction from him, which they did get in the trailer. But it turns out then in the actual episode that it was actually over a land dispute. So there was a boundary stone that was moved and the Brackens were grazing their cattle on Blackwood land. So it ends up becoming a much bigger dispute, and we find out through the dialogue that the Brackens have sided with the Greens, the Blackwoods have sided with Rhaenyra. So at the end of this land dispute, the Bracken boy goes to walk away and calls the boys a babe killer, obviously in reference to their allegiance to Rhaenyra. And this is not taken kindly. The Blackwoods immediately jumped to the defence of the Black Queen. Instead of actually showing us Burnham Mill, they showed us what was left in the wake of Burnham Mill, which is a very interesting decision because a lot of people thought this was going to be our first big battle sequence that we were going to see, but instead they chose to go this route of showing, no, we're not going to show you the gratuitous violence and this whole spectacle of what the war is. Instead we're going to show you the cost of war. And what's so tragic about it too is in the last clip that we got of these boys just before, it almost seems as though both they're obviously significantly detached from where this initial rivalry came from, both being young boys of this house, these houses that have been feuding. We do have this this detachment from the original conflict, but it kind of seems like the grudge is so deep and so embedded into their house and into their identity that there's no way of escaping it. And these boys, although they want to partake and feel involved because they have this kind of embedded into their idea of community within their house, they still have this kind of reluctance. It seems like, when the Bracken boy is called out by the Blackwood, he seems almost like he doesn't want to turn around and face any further conflict. Like he thought he was going to walk away and that was going to be the end of it, but instead we see it blowing up into something because there's this pride that's so unquenchable, and there's this ego that needs satisfied, and he couldn't just stand down in front of his men. He had to engage further, and obviously we've seen that this escalates and these old grudges just completely override reason and spurn these young men into a state of belligerence that attempts at bravery and bravado, but really it just ends with this massive cost that we end up seeing in the next scene, including the shot of the Bracken boy who could have just walked away but had the need to have the last word. So the next scene then goes into this scene that we've already seen in the trailer of the Cargyle twins getting buried together in Dragonstone, and Team Black are all there, and a lot of this scene concerns itself with Rhaenyra being counselled by Rhaenys, and a lot of it is the clips of dialogue that we got in the previous trailers and teasers, so I'll not spend too long on that, but it's essentially saying that once dragons go to war, there will be no winners. It'll be mutually assured destruction, that there is no war as ungodly as a war between kin. And she suggests that Rhaenyra should seek some sort of dialogue with Alicent and try and find some sort of solution. Then we go back to the Red Keep and we have this shot of Kristen Cole leaning over the back of this chair, and one of the workers of the Red Keep comes in and essentially tells them, you're supposed to be at the small council. And we can see that the burden of being Hand to the King is crushing Kristen Cole, that he recognises that he is not fit to lead in this manner. Yes, he has some battle experience, but he has limited experience in politics and he has very little self-restraint, so being in this role isn't necessarily suited to him, and I think that he knows that. So he goes in, he joins the council, and we can really see from this outfall of Otto leaving that the council has completely lost direction, that the Red Keep has fallen into a complete state of shambles. No one really has a distinct direction to go other than towards war, and even that there's no unity in the, you know, planning for this. And Alicent is in this room with all these men who are battle planning and strategizing around her, and, you know, making all these decisions that she and Otto would never make. And so it feels like they've completely, like the Hightowers have completely lost control, despite the fact they've made all these political movements in the past 20 years to get Aegon into the seat of power, just to completely lose the seat of power themselves. Now we have Aegon, who's this completely inexperienced king who's never been given any sort of training for this role and really has no idea what he's doing, and now he's acting out of revenge and rage and grief, and, you know, making all these poor decisions. And one of those poor decisions is getting rid of someone who has been a hand to 3 kings, and despite the fact that he is a completely slimy character that is quite unfavourable, at least he had experience and he was relatively good working in the world of politics. But he has now replaced him with Kristen Cole, who also is very impulsive and inexperienced. And then we have Aemon sitting at the other end of the table, who is, you know, sitting with the biggest weapon of mass destruction in the known world, and is also very impulsive and lacks restraint and is seeking a bit of revenge. So, you know, we see that there is this weak council. Also the fact that he has lost more Kingsguard and then hired on his friends, his friends, his drinking buddies. So we have a weak king with a weak hand to the king, with a bit of a war tyrant at the other end of the table, and a Kingsguard that is completely ill-equipped to actually protect the royal family. And Alicent is sitting at this table with all of these men and being completely overlooked every time that she weighs in, you know. And one of the most notable things that she does say is that they need to relearn discipline, because that is so clearly vacated the room with Otto Hightower, and with her being abandoned with all these men who, you know, have just been having less and less respect for her as the episodes go on. Then we have this clip of Rhaenyra and Mysaria, and it's Rhaenyra going to Mysaria to speak to her about, you know, essentially that she saved her life by coming back and warning that Arik Cargyle had infiltrated the castle. And, you know, Mysaria suggests, well, what is a queen's life worth these days, you know? Like, what's in it for me? What's my reward for this? To which Rhaenyra seems to take, you know, a little bit of offense, but she understands the circumstances of gaining this knowledge and the value of it and the value of her life. So she's like, okay, what do you want? And Mysaria says that she wants to be on her council. So obviously we've seen in the last episode that she was looking to flee all of Westeros and never be involved in politics again, and wanted nothing to do with all of the, you know, the inner workings and the conflict of this royal civil war that's brewing. But then we obviously see that she does kind of want her own retribution for what the Hightowers did to her, and also she sees the benefit in being part of Rhaenyra's council because Rhaenyra had showed her mercy. So this agreement is established, and then at the end of it we see this dialogue where she's asking, are they always like this about the dragons? Because sea smoke is very frantically flying around the water in front of them, and Rhaenyra, you know, states, oh, that's sea smoke, that's my late husband's dragon. And Mysaria says that she thinks he's lonely. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that, because obviously we've seen sea smoke flying around in the last episode too, looking a bit lost. And we get these scenes of Daemon at Harrenhal when he, you know, lands with Caraxes, looks absolutely stunning. All the CG work was incredible, and we see these really adverse weather conditions with, you know, the wind and the rain, and it's really dark and gloomy, and we have the lightning lighting up everything like we've seen in the trailer. It does have these like horror movie-esque shots where he's going through the halls and you're anticipating that he's going to encounter all these guards, because the guards do see him when he's flying in with the Caraxes and seem to run to action, but then the whole time that he's walking through we don't actually see anyone. And eventually we see one who Daemon swiftly deals with, and then he finds this door, and so he walks in, and Sir Simon Strong is sitting there having a dinner with the others in the house, and Daemon proclaims that he has taken the castle. Simon Strong is just like, yeah, sure, absolutely, that's what it looks like. Yeah, okay. I, Sir Simon Strong, pledge fealty to Rhaenyra Targaryen. Daemon is completely baffled because he's like, well, what do you mean? I was ready to come here and start a war. I was ready to come here and start killing. In fact, I came here in a bad mood with the intention to get some of that out, actually. So if you want to send some guards my way, that'd be great. And instead, Simon Strong is like, do you really think that we care about all this? Do you think that we like the ones in King's Landing? And he's like, oh, well, Loras Strong is the Lord of House or Harrenhal. What, do you have no loyalty to him? And Simon Strong makes it very clear that they are more than aware that it was he who killed his father and brother. And, makes the very, very good point that Harrenhal is absolutely soaked. The whole thing, like, even during the summer, they find it difficult to light a fire. So the fact that, those specific sleeping chambers were able to go up in flames and kill those specific two individuals is very, very peculiar, and the only person that would really benefit from that was Loras Strong. Then we're introduced to Gawain Hightower, who is Alicent's brother and Otto's son. We did meet him in season 1, but it was kind of like, it was at the tourney scene, and he was challenged by Daemon and had, his helmet on. So we actually have an actor cast for him now. And wow, does he play a smug and entitled young man very well. We kind of see this dynamic where he does seem to treat Alicent with some respect, but he absolutely does not hold the same respect for Cole in this scene, at least, saying that he's, come so far for a Dornish man, and that, essentially he's making the equivalency, well, you have stolen my father's job. And, it's very convenient that when I started this trip 3 weeks ago down to King's Landing, my father was hand of the king, and now I get here and it's you. But something that really struck me about this scene in particular was the interaction between Cole and Alicent. All the scenes that we've seen of their relationship dynamic so far have been him in service to her, him in subservience to her, and her being idolized as his queen. We see this especially in terms of their sexual relationship in episode 1. We obviously see him in service to her at the start of the episode, and at the end of the episode she's on top of him. And in episode 2 we have a very similar situation where she comes in, she initiates, this sexual encounter by slapping him, and then they get into it. But, it always seems like he is acting in service to her, and she is, using these encounters as a way of regaining power that she feels that she's lost politically. She's trying to regain sexually. Now that he has been elevated in his status and been given this role as Hand of the King, and essentially as the second most powerful man in Westeros, she no longer has this power dynamic over him, and he is very aware of this. He deflects her initial statements in the council and then dismisses her, and speaks directly to Aegon when she's speaking to him. And then we see in this scene here, he has the audacity to ask for a favour from her, and not only, the audacity to ask for a favour whenever he's been quite off with her and just went and completely dismissed her in the council in front of everybody and diminished her power in her seat, but he does this in front of everyone in the courtyard, including her brother, who clearly is onlooking and noticing that there's something going on between these two. Then we get the first scene of Rhaenyra's Black Council in this episode, and really they're just pushing for her to take these dragons and go to war. Obviously not recognising that they have a very finite source of dragons, and that if they send them off to war against Vhagar, they might start losing them very quickly. So we see that they're kind of overlooking Rhaenyra's role, and Rhaenyra is one for restraint, and Rhaenys is counsel to Rhaenyra. There's also this discussion that they haven't heard from Daemon, and so there's just this constant looming threat of his impulsivity and what effect that's going to have, given that it's already had an effect in this season. They also then suggest that maybe it's best that the queen goes elsewhere for her own safekeeping, and that they will rule in her stead, essentially. Rhaenyra very swiftly puts that down, with, well, that will be treason, so I'm glad you didn't take that any further than you did. Maybe watch your mouth. She leaves the room, and we get this amazing sequence from Rhaenys, who comes in and is like, I hope you're all very aware that Rhaenyra wears the, my grandsire's crown, the conciliator. He was the longest ruling king, even over Aegon the Conqueror. The reason that he had this rule go on for so long and be so successful and be so well loved as a king was because he was concerned with peace and, bringing people together, and not just going and taking his dragons and flying off to burn everything. So in between times, we also find out that Queen Rhaenyra wishes to send Rhaena with her two youngest, the twins, Aegon and Viserys, to Pentos, and this is with the case of eggs, the 4 eggs that we've seen in the trailer, and also Aegon's young dragon. So I think we're supposed to believe that one of these eggs is Viserys' egg, which hasn't hatched yet, so I assume this is supposed to be the blue one, and the other 3, they are leaving it to the viewer's imagination what these 3 dragon eggs that are coincidentally the colour of Daenerys' dragon eggs are going to be doing up over in Pentos. But you know, again, like we said in the trailer breakdown video, there is already enough fan speculation. Daenerys' dragon eggs came from Dreamfire, and so this would kind of go against that, but we'll see what they're going to do with it. She also states that she's going to be sending her youngest strong boy, Joffrey, and his dragon Tyraxes to the Vale, to Lady Jane Arryn, since they'd made that deal that they were going to send a dragon to the Vale to keep it protected. This is a very complex scene because there are so many goodbyes that are happening, and there is this transfer of, you know, these really valuable goods, these dragons, these dragon eggs, and all of these children that belong to the royal house, all of these potential heirs being moved to different spaces because, you know, Rhaenyra has essentially admitted, if all fails here, we need to have you elsewhere so that the lineage is protected and so that some of the dragon eggs and the dragons are potentially going to live on. And we also have this conflict, you know, between Rhaenyra and her stepdaughter Rhaena, who feels quite slighted that she's being sent off to Pentos because she doesn't have a dragon. And there's this complex gender dynamic where Rhaenyra is asking her to mother these children because she can't be there to do it, because she now has to fight this war that she's been drawn into. And in the sense that, you know, her mother said to her, you know, we are royal women and our womb is going to be essentially our contribution to the kingdom. But there is this, you know, this looming conflict within her that she is enforcing these same gender dynamics and same gender roles onto, you know, Rhaena now, who doesn't want to be sent away and doesn't want to have to take on a mother role to her stepbrothers, but now, given their circumstances and the fact that war is an inevitability, she has to do this. And, you know, even though it's not what she wants to enforce on these children, because it's not what she wanted to accept herself as a child and she was forced to. And then there's also, you know, these really, really touching leaving scenes intercut with all these, you know, feelings of conflict. And whenever we see her sons coming out and we see those interactions and those goodbyes, it's so explicitly clear to the viewer and to the audience that the relationships that have formed between, you know, those within Team Black are so, you know, emotional and loving and fulfilling for those involved, that they're all really invested in these emotional connections that they've all forged with each other. And so there's actual, you know, weight behind them having to leave and go elsewhere. And this type of emotional connectivity is something that we never see from Team Green, because there is this disconnect and this inability to communicate with each other and to express their love and emotions for each other. So following this really touching scene where the children are leaving Dragonstone, we go back to the Red Keep and we have this encounter between, you know, Helena and Alicent. And whenever we come into the room, Jaehaera is being taken out by one of the servant women, and we get a very brief interaction between Helena and Jaehaera, and it's one of the first times that we actually get to see a loving interaction between, you know, any of the individuals on the Hightower side and their children. And, you know, she's smiling, she's playing with the child before she's taken out of the room, and then she has this conversation with her mother, and she speaks about how, you know, very matter-of-factly, but again, neurodivergent character, she speaks about how she misses Jaehaera's, and then she says that she essentially feels that she's not entitled to, and that she probably shouldn't. And she speaks to her mother about the horrid funeral procession she had to go on and partake in, and she speaks of how the small folk that were there, you know, they probably lose children all the time, and that child loss is so common at this time anyway. Like, she has this real deep insight and understanding where she doesn't let her emotions about the situation cloud, you know, the fact of the matter is that child loss was very common, and that it especially would have been very common for the small folk, which is something that she highlights. And it's the first time we see one of the royals actually put themselves in the position of the small folk and really have empathy for the small folk on that level. And the fact that it comes from Helena, who has just had, members of the small folk enter her chambers and hold a knife to her neck and behead her son in front of her. And then she's put out on this funeral procession where she has some sort of meltdown, some sort of panic attack when the small folk are swarming her. And this extends, beyond the boundaries of looking at her relationship to the small folk. But then she also says to her mother that she forgives her. When she's talking about sadness, and, Alison turns around and she's like, sadness is the condition of motherhood. There is this really gut-wrenching feeling that Alison has lived with all of the sadness since she's had her childhood robbed from her, and she's spent the last 20 years being a mother, and she still feels that she is failing at that, and especially because of what happened to her grandson and how she failed her daughter, feels that she failed her daughter. But Helena turns around and says that she forgives her. So we have this scene here where, we go in and we see that Aegon is trying on this full suit of armour, and we find out that it's Aegon the Conqueror's armour. And just like everything else that he has inherited from Aegon the Conqueror, it is slightly ill-fitting and he looks a bit out of place and uncomfortable. And we also see that he has just hired his drinking buddies and yes men for his new, Kingsguard, and that they are completely not the right fit for the job. Much like he is not the right fit for this armour. And, by the end of it, we see that Lara Strong comes in and starts weaving his web once again, unsurprisingly, and suggests that he should not go to battle, essentially because the people are talking and they're suggesting that, the Green Council is essentially ushering him out to war so that they can instead put Alicent and Aemond in his position of power to rule in his stead, and, creates this friction between the two brothers that I think is essentially the catalyst for what we then see in the brothel scene later on, which also comes after this interaction between him and his men, where he, and I think it's pretty authentically, tells them, you've taken a vow of chastity when they suggest going to the brothel. And it seems almost like, he wants to be taken seriously so bad, but everyone is just repeatedly telling him that he's not. And then anytime he does try and enact any discipline, he doesn't really have the will to actually stick to it. And we see that once a couple of drinks are introduced and he goes back to his old ways of indulging in a bit of alcoholism, that all morals go out the window, and all of a sudden they are in the brothel scene and he no longer cares about his Kingsguard's oaths. Then we're officially introduced to the character of the White, and he's walking around the streets of King's Landing and then goes into this tavern. And, essentially what we see is him going around each of the tables, and he's obviously very popular and very well liked. And then he sits at this table with all of his friends and divulges that he is actually an illegitimate Targaryen. He suggests that Balon was his father, and that he is the half-brother to the late King Viserys and Daemon Targaryen, to which they all kind of remark that he looks nothing like them. But, there is clearly an understanding between his regular friends that he frequents the place with, that they've all obviously heard the story before, and that they kind of accept it to a degree. And this kind of opens up the idea, well, okay, who else knows, because he's obviously had this conversation before with them, and he's just met this other individual that he's telling the story to. So this might be, pretty common fact in King's Landing, and we might see this come back around again. We do hear him saying about how Rhaenyra is the true queen, and talking about his, nephew Jace, who's the true heir to the Iron Throne. So he's making his allegiance very clear, although as soon as Aegon walks into the bar, he is the first to say, "All hail King Aegon." This is what I mean here. I feel that once Aegon goes into this brothel and he makes a V-line for Sylvie, he probably has a good idea that Aemond is going to be in there, and he creates this whole spectacle with his Kingsguard and with this new squire that he wants to, mock his brother. And his brother is lying there naked in a vulnerable position. He is comfortable with this woman. He's lying in the fetal position again, and this older woman is clearly acting like a motherly figure to him. And Aegon just turns this into an entire joking spectacle, mocking him and talking about how Aemond the Fierce is in this brothel and he's lying with his first. Aegon just doesn't value this at all and just makes a complete mockery out of him. And I think a lot of this kind of comes from that insecurity that he felt earlier whenever Laris was talking about how people are talking and saying that they essentially want him out of the picture so that they can get Alicent and Aemond and Rowan in his stead. So he had that insecurity and he wanted to take that out on his brother and make him feel insecure as well by going in and mocking him in this brothel in front of all these people. This of course results in Aemond getting up and leaving and, you know, making this hurtful comment towards Sylvie that they tried to say that he had this special interest in her, particularly because he lost his virginity to her, and he wanted to make out that he had no such emotional attachment really to anything, and especially not to this woman. And I really hope that there's some type of payoff in the next couple episodes where she really hurts his feelings. I want this body to get his feelings hurt, and I want it to be Sylvie that does it. I think something else that is notable in this scene, because we have been kind of sympathizing with Aegon so much in the last couple of episodes, because in the first episode he was so endearing and, you know, first day on the job, and then obviously in the last episode because he had just lost his son and heir. And so in this episode it kind of feels like they're bringing back more of that darkness, and we obviously see this scene, but just before this in the bar we see the servant woman that he raped, and she's even sexually assaulted in that scene by one of Ulf's friends who, you know, slaps her on the way past. We're kind of reminded that no, Aegon, you know, as much as we've developed these sympathies for him and we've been endeared to him to a degree, he has still done these awful things and is much more of a complex and nuanced character. Something else that I thought was notable in, you know, this scene where Aegon goes into the bar and everyone kind of stands up, and this is immediately in the wake of him having just murdered 99 innocent rat catchers, you know, who were of the small folk and whose loved ones probably would have been in those crowds. They were all very quick to forget about this murder and this mistreatment of the small folk when he offered free drinks to everyone. So there is this weird kind of complicated dynamic between Aegon and small folk, because he does venture into the streets of King's Landing and to Flea Bottom into the Street of Silk, and he does have somewhat of a relationship with these people and this commonality of, you know, I dwell amongst you even when it's only at my worst and when I'm most depraved. So then we get the absolute best sequence of the whole episode, where we get Bella and Moondancer, and she's patrolling the skies of King's Landing, and she sees the light hitting off Kristen Cole's armour, or one of the men's armours, and she decides that she's going to take Moondancer on an absolute nosedive and try to, I don't know if her intention was actually to catch any of these men, but God, I hope she did, because Kristen Cole and Gwen Hightower, you could have got 2 for 1. My God, I have very little to say about this sequence other than, you know, it was nice to see the character development and, you know, the look of determination in her eyes whenever she sees these men and she realizes, you know, I have the decision. I can either stay up here and patrol, or I can take some action and give these men a scare, and she decides to do the latter, obviously. Also getting to see her absolutely stunning dragon, Moondancer. So then we see Bella go back to Dragonstone to report what she'd seen. That obviously the men had advanced out of the castle and were making movements towards the Crownlands and probably Riverlands. And within this council, you know, Rhaenyra is like, can you be sure, you know, how did you see them from such a height? And Bella immediately admits it wasn't from such a height. We get this look here. Rhaenyra is clearly seeing a lot of her husband in Bella. You know, she is seeing that Bella is definitely her father's daughter, and, you know, she's given these very strict instructions to, you know, not engage, stay above, don't be seen, be inconspicuous, and obviously Bella does not do this, and it looks like she's almost about to, you know, chastise her for this to some degree, even though it was good for reconnaissance that she did go up and identify. But her counsel essentially is like, yeah, Bella done a great job, and we really need to stop doing what you, the Queen, is suggesting and get these dragons out. We return to Harrenhal, and we haven't been here since Daemon has taken Harrenhal for Queen Rhaenyra, and, you know, at this stage he has been given these living quarters and he has barricaded himself in with a sword. And again we see these like horror movie-esque shots of the shadow of these feet going underneath the door and somebody trying to get in. He goes, grabs Stark's sister and unsheathes her, goes up to the door and is ready for conflict once again, any excuse to cut someone down. but he opens the door and there's no one there, despite the fact he has clearly just seen these feet under the door. So he falls down the hall where he can hear this humming, and he walks into this room. There's this girl with white hair singing what seems to be a Valerian song, and he goes closer and she turns around and it's young Rhaenyra. And she's talking about how you're always gallivanting off and I'm always having to pick up the pieces after you. This look of like complete horror takes over his face because he's obviously entered some sort of dream sequence, and we're not sure if this is, there's been discussion about whether he might be a dreamer because of this, or whether it's because Harrenhal is considered to be a very haunted space, and Alice Rivers, because she appears on it, I am under the impression that she has something to do with it because she is considered the Witch of Harrenhal, and because it is considered such a haunted space anyway, I don't really think that they're going to try and give Daemon a dragon dreamer type of spun to his character. As part of this dream sequence, we have young Rhaenyra here, and she makes this statement, and then the camera pans and we see she is stitching Jaehaerys's head back on. They were so reserved with the violence and the gore in episode 1 that they've really made up for it in the last 2 episodes with regard to the whole fallout of Blood and Cheese by having the stitched up head and then doubling down on it in this episode and making it 10 times worse and more graphic by having young Rhaenyra stitching it back on. There's something so jarring and unsettling and harrowing about this scene that even in this scene, Daemon is crying, and that's not something that I would have expected in response to this, because it is so heavily implied that he gave approval and clearance that if Blood and Cheese couldn't find Daemon, that they could take the head of Prince Jaehaerys. It's like it's making him confront his wrongdoings. He done wrong by Rhaenyra, especially young Rhaenyra. There's this really complicated and predatory dynamic between the pair, and then we have poor Prince Jaehaerys, who's getting his head stitched back on, who he obviously was done extremely wrong by Daemon, who essentially paid for his execution. He then drops his sword, and within the dream sequence he blinks, he wakes up, he's out in this courtyard, and he's standing at the foot of a weirwood tree, and then we see Alice Rivers, and she appears and she says, "You're gonna die here," and walks away, and just leaves this really ominous sense of foreboding. Then we have this final really significant sequence, and it starts with Rhaenyra going to Mysaria, and Mysaria, as her new Master of Whispers essentially on the Black Council, she directs her how she would potentially find Alicent if she wishes to speak to her, which we established when Rhaenyra was cleaning up all of her children's toys and she sees the letter that Alicent sent, basically apologising for what happened to Luke and wanting to have some sort of discussion. And so she goes to Mysaria, and Mysaria, suggests it'd be easier to kill her than to get some sort of one-on-one meeting with her, because she's always surrounded by guards. And she says, there is this one place you might be able to meet with her. And then we cut to a scene where Rhaenyra is being brought into King's Landing. She's being dressed as a septa, and it does kind of evoke this imagery of the shame imagery, and the irony that she's going and meeting up with Alicent when Alicent is so heavily downtrodden at the minute with this idea that she has sinned and that she's being punished by the gods for her sins. But then we see this coming together of these two after all this time and after all this conflict and after all this blood has been spilled since their last meeting, and the fact their last meeting was a joyous one and one where it actually seemed like they were about to fix their relationship to some degree. And then this is their next one. It comes under very different circumstances, but still with the hopes that they can find some sort of peaceful solution instead of having to go to all-out civil war. This is actually the first time that we see Rhaenyra act somewhat impulsively and really put herself in harm's way and do something that is quite illogical for the sake of trying to make a last-ditch attempt at securing peace for the realm, even at her own expense. So Alicent goes into the sept and sits down. She lights her candle and she starts to pray, and then Rhaenyra, dressed as a septa, enters and sits beside her. Alicent turns, realises who it is, and before she has the time to gasp, Rhaenyra pulls a knife, and Alicent is essentially like, okay, well, what are you doing? What if I scream? And Rhaenyra is like, well, yeah, they'll probably take me and execute me, but not before I kill you. And then she kind of has this fumble where she's like, oh, I've started poorly, and it's so bizarre because this hasn't been planned. and she's going in there and she's just kind of off the cuff trying to carry out this meeting in the most efficient way possible, in the quickest way possible, with really no planning or support. She seems to revert almost to this state of girlhood, and both of them kind of start to have this conversation of reminiscent and then conflict, speaking about, the last time we were here and we were praying together, and then there was the tourney, and it was kind of all this violence and, these complicated themes of motherhood, obviously, because the tourney was interspersed with these images of Queen Emma when she was given birth, and how she died in the birth in bed, and her son also died, and then the violence of the actual tourney itself. It's kind of all these different sequences of violence that begets this actual scene. The civil war is coming to a head, and these two women are sitting down trying to have this discussion, and then they actually start talking about the line of succession, and Alicent is so determined in that she's like, no, absolutely, I'm 100% sure your father changed his mind and you're just refusing to accept it. And then we see this look come over Rhaenyra where she does start to accept it. Her eyes full with tears and she's very sorrowful, and she starts to doubt her relationship with her father, because she was always so convinced that he was steadfast right to the end, that, she was to be his heir. Then she speaks more, and, Rhaenyra wants to confirm, did he say my name? She said no, he said Aegon's name, and he's a prince that was promised. And then it suddenly dawns on Rhaenyra that he was talking about the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, and she says, he told you about Song of Ice and Fire, because, obviously she knows that this just passes from king to heir within the Targaryen family. So she's kind of bewildered at the start. And when Alicent also looks bewildered and clearly doesn't know what she's talking about, Rhaenyra realizes that there's been a mistake and a misunderstanding, and that all this was based off a mistake, much like the situation with Luke was a mistake, the situation with Jaehaerys was a mistake, and now this whole usurping was also based off a mistake and a misunderstanding. So it's just, the whole theme of this whole season, of this whole show, is just a consequence of mistake and misunderstanding, and how this ends up having really tumultuous results for everybody else involved. And, she's trying to suggest, no, this is a mistake, it's a misunderstanding, like, we can fix this. And Alicent is, once it kind of dawns on her, the initial dawning on Rhaenyra of, oh, maybe my father didn't want me as heir, is then corrected, and it starts to dawn on Alicent, oh no, I was actually wrong, and I completely misinterpreted that. Then she has to take this steely expression and this cold approach to Rhaenyra, because she realises that she's made a mistake, but it's gone too far, and there's no dialing back now, that all these men have already marched to war, and this war council is already in, so severely into the planning stages, and they completely disrespect Alicent anyway, that she has no hold any longer. She is very much stating to Rhaenyra, no, there's no mistake being made, I have to go, I can't speak to you any longer. And Rhaenyra is trying to continue this conversation, but she's not having it. And then she turns around and she's like, Rhaenyra, my father's gone, and now it's cold as the hand of the king, and you know what he's like, and you know what my son Aemon does, and my son Aegon is in the throes of grief, and these men are all acting. There is no way we can stop this now. And it's this really, really cold interaction as she leaves, and it's so disappointing to see these two characters who were once so loving and affectionate with each other, and they almost get to some sort of understanding with each other for a very brief second at the end of this episode, and then all of a sudden it dawns on the pair of them that despite the fact that they are woman in power within this society, they still don't have the power to stop what's begun. So that was our look at episode 3 for season 2 of House of the Dragon. I'll probably do a look at the trailer after this, and maybe go into some other themes as well to do different breakdown videos on, if that's something that you're interested in.